LinkedIn News.
How do we continue to evolve vibrantly through every stage of life?
Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, this is In the Arena, a podcast exploring human potential. I'm Leah Smart, and every week you'll find me right here in conversation with bright minds and brave hearts, learning how we can improve our lives and our world by transforming ourselves. Okay, so I am really excited to bring you today's guest. It is the one and only Cheryl Strayed. And if for some reason that name doesn't ring a bell for you, have you ever seen the movie Wild with Reese Witherspoon? That movie is based on Cheryl's best-selling memoir. She's also the best-selling author of the book Tiny Beautiful Things, one of my favorites. It's a collection of advice columns that tackle life's biggest questions with candor and with grace. And the book was actually turned into a show called Tiny Beautiful Things, which just premiered on Hulu on April 7th. It's honestly an emotional roller coaster that's meant to tug at all of our heartstrings, but also to put us in awe of everyday life. So Cheryl joined me to share how vulnerability has played a crucial role in her life, her journey to becoming a best-selling memoirist, and her ability to connect with her audience on a deeper level. What I love about Cheryl's work is it taps into universal themes we can all relate to, no matter who we are or where we come from. Things like love, loss, joy, redemption, hardship, and resilience. This episode and our conversation is absolutely going to inspire you to embrace your vulnerability, to tell your story, and to do it with courage and authenticity, whether it's through writing, like Cheryl's done, or just over dinner. But first, I wanted to know what it's like for Cheryl to look back at her massive success after her wild ride.
Well, first of all, I want to say, I think that all the people I've touched is my greatest success, for sure. And that is the thing I dreamed of when I first felt called to be a writer as a child. I wanted to make other people feel the way I felt when I read words that I felt known by, that I felt showed me the pain of existence and the beauty of the world and what it feels like to, have the sun on your face and what it feels like to fall in love and what it feels like to lose and grieve. That is what we can find in literature. And so I wanted to be a writer who made people feel more human, who made people feel less alone. And I never set out to write an advice column. I'm a novelist. When I published Torch and I just finished writing Wild, I was asked to write this Dear Sugar column. And I said yes, just really on a kind of lark. What I pretty quickly learned was that, why am I writing an advice column? I'm not a therapist. I didn't ever even take a class in psychology. But I realized that apprenticing myself to the craft of writing, training as a writer, had trained me to give advice. Because of course, as a writer, what you have to do is imagine the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we live and the stories that we have to live down. And I began from that premise of, giving people advice by telling stories and by listening very closely to the stories they told me. And, this lark thing ended up being some of the most powerful work of my career. As you know, Tiny Beautiful Things came out 10 years ago, and it was reissued recently, a 10th anniversary edition with some new columns. And what I'm really struck by is that new people have come to it, over all this decade plus. And even though time has passed, and even though sometimes I'm talking to a man or a woman or somebody in their 60s or somebody who's in their 20s, they all say the same things to me about the column and about their responses and feelings about it. And it's that you may not have that particular experience or that particular problem or trauma. There is something in it that also ends up being about you, that there is a universal thread that at the core of those kinds of problems or questions or confusions or griefs that we have, there is that we're all included in that. Because of course, to be human is to suffer. To be human is to see beauty and to feel love. It's all the whole spectrum. What I still feel reinvigorated by again and again is just that literature, that sentences, that words on the page or the screen can be a kind of healing, can be a kind of consolation, and can be the kind of illumination that reminds us that we're not alone.
Just as I'm sitting here listening to you and looking at Tiny Beautiful Things and also Brave Enough, which I marked my favorite quote in there that I'm going to read and I want to talk about because I just loved it. When I first bought the book, I started reading it and I didn't have a word yet for empathy, but I knew that I was reading the book and I was feeling like I so deeply could understand that person's experience and almost felt their pain in some ways, even if I didn't, relate to the story. And so I would have to come to it and then leave it because I didn't understand that fully. But there is something really powerful and healing about being willing to go there. And I think you and I probably are two people who are willing to go there, and I think, for you with your history, you've been through so much. And so your ability to go there is probably also very tied to the fact that you've been there. For me, I haven't been some of these places yet, but I have a feeling of understanding and experience when I read these. What do you think it is that makes certain people willing to go there or not? And I think I've always had that ability, but then I notice so many people who don't want to or can't or choose not to. But I also feel like they miss out on the richness of life.
Absolutely. I agree. So let's just define to go there. I think really what we're talking about is vulnerability, which is another word for honesty, transparency, a willingness to tell the truth about who you are and what you want and how you feel.
And to see the truth of others, too.
Yes, right. And to receive it. It's a reciprocal thing. There are some people who can sit and listen to somebody else's vulnerability and then they'll say, oh, that's a nice story. Thank you for sharing, and they don't share. So I do think it begins with the self, and not in a narcissistic way, but that to be truly vulnerable, you have to be willing to tell the truth about who you are, bottom line. And this, of course, there are just layers and layers and layers of reasons that people either can't do that or are afraid to do that or need to be really encouraged and supported to do that. For most of us, there is some kind of journey that we have to go on to get to that place where we feel like it's not only safe to tell the truth, but it's safer to tell the truth. That actually, we use that phrase to risk vulnerability. And in my way of thinking, the far, far, far greater risk is to never be vulnerable, to try to stay safe inside, I think, what I would call the lie, that shield that you think protects you, but actually keeps you from your deepest transformation, your fullest evolution. And so, I teach writing on occasion. And, one of the things that always comes up right away, how do I dare to write my story? How do I dare to tell the truth of my relationship or my childhood or how I feel about my body or my career or whatever it is, right? And of course, people are afraid. They're afraid of two things. They're afraid of being condemned and judged, and they're afraid that the people who know and love them will cast them out. Will say you don't get to belong to us anymore because you tell the truth. What I've found as somebody now who's written a lot of personal stuff is you won't be alone there when you tell the truth. That people will say, when you're vulnerable, it will actually not repel people from you, but it'll draw people to you, right? It's so much more, we feel so much safer with people who dare to show us some of that messiness that we were just talking about. And then, of course, the other people casting you out, I think the deep question you need to ask is if the price of admission for a relationship with those people is that you pretend to be somebody you aren't, that you don't express how you feel or say what you want, that's too high a price to pay. Right. That in some ways, telling the truth, it's a way of setting a boundary, saying, I will no longer live by your rules, but I will set my own. Vulnerability is something that many of us have to learn as adults because the world has told us it's not safe to be vulnerable.
I didn't even really understand the concept until 2018.
Oh my gosh, Leah.
I know. It's shocking.
Why is that? To me, what I was going to say is one of the biggest myths is that vulnerability is weakness, right? We all know if you're strong, you don't cry, you don't reveal yourself. And I say, rewrite that script. Vulnerability is strength.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you absorbed that message.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so it was my discovery of Brene Brown through a friend who helped me understand, like, I am definitely a heady intellectual kind of person. So having the understanding of what was actually happening when I was or wasn't being vulnerable, what that even looked like to be vulnerable, it was something I just didn't get. And I'd probably built up defenses around my choices about being vulnerable or not. And I grew up in California, but I grew up mostly surrounded by people who didn't look like me, where I was constantly trying to fit in, right? And so vulnerability often meant I wasn't necessarily safe with the people that I was with if I wasn't kind of fitting in and doing the things that felt aligned enough to be like them. When I went to college in a town where it's very similar and spending more time worried about other people and how I fit in than myself and how I found my authentic self and then belonged to myself and to people who were the right people to belong to versus the ones I thought I wanted to fit in with. So I think it was almost that I had a shield up around the idea of being vulnerable because it didn't feel safe.
Yeah, and it wasn't. That's the interesting twist because, of course, as much as you and I are both like, vulnerability is, the key to happiness in life and all of that. It's also true that sometimes there's a reason that we're not able to take that risk of vulnerability until we're old enough that we are independent. I mean, I'm thinking of kids who are LGBTQ, who are growing up in households, in some cases where they would honestly be putting themselves at real physical and psychological risk to tell the truth about who they are. Sometimes, sadly, just like you said, you had to keep yourself safe in the community that didn't look like you. And there are sometimes, sadly, times that we have to say, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait until I can stand on my own 2 feet and then take that risk. And once you do, your life opens up beautifully. But there are times that we, I think, make really wise choices to hold that shield.
Yeah, even if we don't have the language, I hadn't really explained that until you said it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't have the language, but I certainly knew what I was doing. And it wasn't until I became more vulnerable, and I agree, life totally opens up, that everything transformed. And now I have a very different sense of self that has nothing to do with anyone else and everything to do with my own connection to myself.
Right.
Like my own sense of self-worth that comes from a connection to myself and something greater. When we're talking about vulnerability, it reminds me of one of your quotes that you shared that I think was your mom's. It's put yourself in the way of beauty. And I love that quote. And it also has a different meaning for me in this conversation in that I've thought of it typically as like beauty meaning all the good stuff. When in reality, we know it means everything.
Yeah.
And that everything actually can be beautiful in a way, even when it's difficult. And you can only really connect the dots, I think, when you are looking back. How do you think about that, especially now as we're finding people continually in the midst of a lot of questions right now in the world?
Yeah. I think that's true, that beauty can be all kinds of things. It can be the tiny, beautiful things, those little gestures of kindness in the hardest time of our lives. It can be acknowledging that nothing is the way that we want it to be. That there's a letter in Tiny Beautiful Things from the columns called The Human Scale. It's from a woman who had written to me, and her baby had a tumor and was going into surgery the next day. It was a 6-month-old baby. And she wrote to me and said, like, how can there be a God? How can this terrible thing happen to me? How can there be, anything right in the world if this can happen to my baby? And one of the things that I wrote back to her is like, well, maybe your God isn't the thing that's going to swoop down and save your baby, but maybe it's that those acts of kindness of all the people around you who are saying things like, we're sending love, we're holding you in our thoughts, we're praying for you, that those small gestures in many ways are the things that save us in the hardest times. And that is really the way that my mom talked to me about that quote, put yourself in the way of beauty. She would say to me, Cheryl, you're going to have hard days. You're going to have times that you see nothing good in your life or in the world, but it's up to you to go find it. You have the opportunity every day. There is always a sunrise and always a sunset, and it's up to you to go out there and be there for it. Go out and find it, put yourself in the way of beauty. And of course, in the good times, it's not hard to do. because beauty's all around
Right.
us. You're like,
Right. You're dancing down the street.
You look in the mirror and you're like, I'm looking good and I'm feeling good.
Yeah.
But those days where everything is difficult. And of course, there have been many of them. And there have been many of them in the world, obviously during the pandemic. But frankly, it's also true that I don't know that there's been a day in either of our lives that we couldn't look around the world and find a terrible tragedy or war or loss or trauma that is devastating, right? There's always hardship. There's always suffering. And there's also always beauty. When I was a kid and my mom said that to me, put yourself in the way of beauty, I rolled my eyes. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're such a Pollyanna and so optimistic. And, I didn't want any part of it. And what I realized is how powerful it was to actually know that in my bones, to have that kind of optimism be part of me, because it's optimism that is tied to agency. It's saying you put yourself in the way of beauty, that it's up to you to, in the hard times, find a way to thrive and to feel some sense of peace and some sense of joy. And, I don't know one person who has healed themselves who hasn't ultimately done it themselves. We all have and need support and resources and people around us. But in the end, it is up to you. In the end, you have to decide what you're going to seek. And that quote, really is to me a guiding light.
I love that mention of optimism tied to agency. So yeah, putting yourself in the way of beauty. When I think about some of the tough stuff, when I bought your book Brave Enough a while ago, it was 5 years ago or so, and I used to just open it randomly and I would just read a quote and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I got it. That resonates. Or I'm inspired. One day I had gone through the ending of a relationship and I was having such a tough time. And I live in New York and I would go by the water and I would journal and I was learning all of these different tools. So I felt really prepared to experience it, but you can't prepare for the it, right? It's you have all the tools and then it happens and you're wait, you're grasping for them and trying to figure out what to do. But I found this quote and I really loved it. And I think it's one that for anyone who's going through a tough time can be meaningful. And it's, you let time pass. That's the cure. You survive the days. You float like a rapid ghost through the weeks. You cry and wallow and lament and scratch your way back up through the months. And then one day you find yourself alone on a bench in the sun and you close your eyes and lean your head back and you realize you're okay. That is I used to take this book with me to the water and I would read it and cry because I was like, oh my God. It was just it's such a beautiful quote.
That's Oprah's favorite quote too in the book.
Oh, I didn't know that.
She loves that one. But,
wow.
And I think to me, I wrote that because it's true. That feels most powerful for me to remember as well is that you're going to be okay. That even though the hard times end and you will be okay. But any one of us, all of your listeners, you and I know when you survive that hard thing, that heartbreak, that loss, that, rejection, that trauma, when you kind of let time pass and arrive on the other side of it, you think, okay, maybe I'm not great, but you know what? I'm okay.
Yeah.
And, I got chills saying it because I know that feeling where you're like, I'm going to be okay. That means you're on the path and you keep going and you can.
Oof. And you can. My version of that is it's enough. I started saying that because I realized I have this sort of insatiable desire to learn and do and be. And part of the reason I'm stressed is because I'm always doing things. And so I have to I work with myself in that I recognize it's not more than I need. It's enough. And so with just saying that sometimes it's enough helps me feel oh, yeah, I'm fine. I want things to feel like this instead of this.
That's right. And people on your podcast can't see this, but you're making a wonderful wave, like a little, a dolphin jumping up above the waves with your hand. Yeah, that's up and down. And sometimes things just go along. And that is a beautiful thing too.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Cheryl Strayed on how sharing our authentic stories can show us how alike we all are. And we're back with Cheryl Strayed, bestselling author of Tiny Beautiful Things and Wild. You're transcribing your journals, you're in this sort of different phase. And like you said, you're looking back and you've had amazing success. I can't wait to watch Tiny Beautiful Things.
Yes.
I loved Wild. Everyone did. You've had just an amazing career. I am, and I think a lot of people are inspired by stories like yours where you didn't start off with a whole bunch to do what you've done with your life.
No, I grew up poor and really, I was always ambitious. I always knew that college was going to be a path that would open up my life. And I wasn't wrong about that. I didn't know anyone growing up who wrote books or anything. So when I went to college, I was like, oh my gosh, my professors are doing what I want to do. They've written books. And I just trusted that and followed it. And of course, a lot has happened. But I think in so many ways, like, doing these transcriptions. I'm also working on my next book, which is a memoir, and doing the transcriptions has really helped me in that, because part of being a memoirist is, forever returning to that cave of the self and the lived life to remember not just your own story, but the human story, right? Like the point of Wild wasn't like, look at me, I went on a long hike and my mom died and I have the biggest broken heart in the whole world. The point was instead, what is the story of what does it mean to lose and to go on? What is the story of what does it mean to feel like you can't bear what you have to bear? And
is that what you mean by the human story, like the bigger story, or that?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is, I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding about memoir, where people will think like, wow, okay, to write a book, you have to have done some wild thing, no pun intended. And nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to the way I approach writing about myself. I didn't write Wild until years after I took my hike, right? And the reason for that is because I needed to figure out the story that wasn't about me. Like if you and I had met, Leah, in the years after I took my hike, I would have told you about my hike and we would have had an interesting conversation about it because it was an interesting and powerful experience in my life. But when you take your life and make it into art, you have to find that kind of universal meaning, by which I mean the ways in which the story applies to other people, the story beyond the self. So you use the self to say, I'm going to tell us about us. So when I write about, for example, that scene in Wild where, for your listeners who don't know the book, it's about my 1,100-mile hike on the Pacific Crest Trail. And on day one of my hike, I'm in this motel room in Mojave, California, and I pack up my backpack for the first time, which I don't recommend, but there it was. And I couldn't lift it. And I had to lift it. That was the paradox, right? I can't do what I must do. And I realized when I was writing years later, sort of trying to find my way into this book, oh yeah, this is the universal thread I'm talking about. Because of course, in that particular moment in my life, I had to do something that was incredibly hard that I thought I couldn't do. Both lift the backpack and carry it 1,100 miles, but also as a young woman, let go of my mother, my mother had died at 45 of cancer. And I felt like I cannot live without her. I cannot bear the world without her. And yet I had to. And so those threads that were so powerful within my own life, I realized are, of course, threads that are powerful in all of our lives, because every one of us eventually has to do something we think we can't do. We have to bear something we think we can't bear. And so the writer's job is to have that consciousness that goes beyond that individual character, whether it be a person or a fictional character. You have to have the consciousness that says, this is a story I'm telling about all of us. And so I'm writing my next memoir at the same time that I'm transcribing these journals. And so I'm seeing the threads. I'm finding those mysterious threads that are deeply about me and deeply about us. And also you mentioned Tiny Beautiful Things is going to be a Hulu TV show. And I was a writer on the show, an executive producer. And that too has been just incredibly exciting to be a part again of like this adaptation where I've already written the book, and now to see the way that other artists take meaning from it and tell stories.
I love that this has become a project again. Like when I think about Tiny Beautiful Things, I think you could read it multiple times over a lifetime because you come back to these stories. And so it's one of those things that I think has an infinite life because it's not just about the experience or the moment. So I'm curious, what have you learned when you think about us? This show is about living a meaningful life. What do you believe you've learned about how we do that?
Just a little question.
Tiny question.
Right, Leah?
2 minutes.
Tiny. What do I know about us? A lot. A lot. But I would say that the first one is that we're all afraid in a lot of ways, that we all struggle and suffer. Even those of us who, when you look at them, you think they have it all together. They have great contentment. They think they're wonderful. They're just gliding right along. There's even a line in the title column of Tiny Beautiful Things is, some people who appear to be gliding right along have suffered and are suffering. And I think that that's been such a privilege of a lifetime as Sugar to be the recipient of so many letters, so many people saying to me, everything seems fine, but everything actually hurts, or I'm scared, or I don't know what to do next, or I seem to have the perfect happy marriage and I actually really want to leave my partner, or, fill in the blank, right? It's given me just a tremendous amount of empathy for everyone. In our suffering and struggles and confusions and sorrows, we're not alone. And so there is power and beauty to be found in telling the true stories about who we are. I think at heart, Tiny Beautiful Things is about that. It's essentially layers of stories about people who are doing the best they can do. And I always think about that. When somebody writes me a letter, they're essentially telling me a story about themselves, and I write them a letter back. And I tell them a little something about me, and I tell them a little something about what I think of their situation. But ultimately, I'm trying to talk to all of us about how we might better thrive, or how we might better find clarity, or how we might better have deeper compassion for ourselves and for others.
That's the conversation again. Like you mentioned, it's about empathy. It's about the understanding that any of us could read this book and take something away, no matter who we are, where we're from. Nothing but yourself will hold you back from taking something away from this book. And so there's the suffering piece. And then you also call yourself an agathist, right? Which is agathism is the idea that all things tend toward ultimate good. How do you balance that? What are the things that you do to both understand that unifying concept and then live into this agathism?
I love that you asked about agathism. It's a word that not a lot of people know.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
Like, this was new. Thank you.
Isn't it a cool word?
Yeah.
I put it on my, I think it's on my Instagram bio or something, because and it's really wonderful that you are asking this question now, because in some ways it brings us back to one of the very first things we talked about. I mentioned this idea of the binary, that we're good or we're bad, or we're this or we're that. And it's these opposites. And that somehow healing or transformation or having a good life is a movement from one thing to the other, the bad to the good, or, and what I'm trying to propose is we're all constantly moving back and forth between all the things, right? And they're all within us. And that's, agathism to me is about saying I know bad things happen. I know life is hard. I just want you to know. I'm not saying this as somebody who receives a lot of letters. I'm saying this to you also as a human. I've actually in the last few years had among the very hardest few years of my life, that I sit here talking to you on your podcast as somebody who's had lots of good things, lots of happy things happen to me, all of this stuff. And I have also struggled mightily and fiercely and suffered mightily and fiercely. And I think that for me, agathism is about saying bad things happen, hard things happen. There is beauty. You can put yourself in the way of beauty. So if you say one is optimism and one is pessimism, the pessimist just life is just a bunch of struggle and suffering, and what's the point? And if optimism is look on the bright side, better days ahead, agathism is saying they both exist. They both exist, and I am going to put my money on beauty because I am always going to put myself in the way of that.
Wow. We can stop right there. I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements, Cheryl. The first is better humans are
kind.
Better work is
work you love.
And a better world has.
Empathy.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here. This was wonderful.
What a wonderful conversation, Leah. Thank you for such great, insightful questions. I loved our conversation.
Me too. Me too. I hope we can do it again.
I do too. Yay.
That was the amazing Cheryl Strayed, best-selling author of Wild and Tiny Beautiful Things, now a TV show on Hulu. One big thing before we go. Vulnerability is a vital component of the human experience. By being open about our challenges and what we've learned, we allow others to see us as we truly are, which, in the right hands, fosters some pretty deep connections. The other benefit? Sharing our stories is a way to make sense of experiences through meaning. Plus, you never know who you'll inspire to do the same. If this conversation was inspiring for you and has you reflecting on ways to be even more vulnerable, share it with someone else who might benefit from doing the same. Maybe this conversation can help them find what they've been looking for. And help other people like you find our show by leaving us a rating before you go. Even better, send me a quick voice note to inthearena@linkedin.com telling me a way you practice being more vulnerable. And, as always, you can find me on LinkedIn writing about human potential and meaningful living. In the Arena is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Alexis Ramdow and Rafa Fariha. Asaf Gidron makes sure we sound good in the studio. Joe DeGiorgi mixed our show. Enrique Montalvo is the executive producer of LinkedIn Editorial Productions. Dave Pond is head of news production. Courtney Coop is head of LinkedIn Original Audio and Video. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.